topic tonight is ancient Israel, what remains. And I sort of fear I may have somewhat lured you here under false pretenses. When I say ancient Israel here, I mean specifically the northern kingdom of Israel that existed from the time of Jeroboam the first until the fall of Samaria. We'll also actually be touching a little bit on Solomon tonight as well. And the reason for this slightly confined scope is actually because this was a topic that I researched and presented on as part of the HSC Ancient History course for Heritage Lake Macquarie. So there's it was a really fascinating topic to look at, and really enjoyed it. And that's kind of the scope of what we're going to be looking at tonight. And there is actually, I guess, some spiritual benefit to looking particularly at the Northern Kingdom. For starters, it is somewhat of a neglected topic, not only in Bible study, but also just in archaeology and history in general. People have tended to spend a lot more time studying the Southern Kingdom of Judah for obvious reasons. It focuses on Jerusalem, on the line of King David, and the Davidic dynasty, and of course, all of that leads up to Jesus. So, why wouldn't you? And indeed, there's a lot more historical and archaeological evidence around the Southern Kingdom, which is interesting given that it was a bit smaller, a bit more localized, but it did last for a lot longer than the Northern Kingdom. So that's sort of so much to say that Judah is a topic that's pretty well covered in many areas, and I encourage you to follow it up on your own. But tonight we'll be looking at the Northern Kingdom of Israel. And the Northern Kingdom is kind of the negative image of the Southern Kingdom of Judah. Really, its history illustrates what happens when God's people stop caring about God. It's a very powerful spiritual lesson, its history. And I guess it in that way it provides a powerful warning for us as God's people about the dangers for us of stopping caring about God and what impact that might have. And it also still provides a really important historical backdrop and comparison to the more commonly studied, as I said, history of Judah. It still is, of course, very relevant to that in terms of culture and history. I will say as well, it's sort of interesting to think about the Northern Kingdom as really a fairly pointed message from God to Solomon and to his son Rehoboam about kind of the logical conclusion of what would happen to their empire and their kingdom without God. Having lost the northern 10 tribes, Rehoboam was being confronted with the fact that, well, without God, without Jerusalem, without the promises to David, really he wasn't anything. And that led to their culture just gradually being eroded and consumed by the nations around them. And we'll see a lot of that in what we look at tonight. We're going to be viewing a series of sources for the history of ancient Israel, primarily through a historical lens. And we're going to be asking kind of what do these sources tell us about the society and the time period. So we're going to go on kind of a bit of a museum tour, including various sites and artifacts. And as I said, there's not as many sites and artifacts available as there are for the Kingdom of Judah, but there are still some, and they're very interesting, and they're possibly a bit neglected, possibly things you haven't looked at before. And we'll also look at the main remnant of the Northern Kingdom, which is the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a historical text. I've spoken, probably the last time I did Bible class for Moorbank, I spoke about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they demonstrate that the Old Testament is indeed a very ancient text. And we've got various evidence that points it even further back. And we know that it's a very powerful source for the history of Israel and Judah. Now, it's interesting when I did this in a classroom context, in an ancient history context, to talk to students about the fact that, yes, the Bible is an important historical source, but you have to read it with its purpose in mind. Even the books of the Bible that we normally treat as history, like Kings and Chronicles, that's the category we put those in, have a very strong religious focus. They're there to uphold the righteous kings who followed after God, who followed after Yahweh, and it's there to condemn and hold up as a bad example the kings who departed from God. So we always have to keep that in mind. But when we view it through that and we keep that in mind, we can use these as really valuable historical sources. We'll be considering also some passages that were intended to have a spiritual application, specifically, for instance, prophecies, very specific spiritual application there. We're going to be looking at them for their historical implications and the assumptions that they involve. They'll use references to everyday activities and places and activities that, while they're using them to illustrate a spiritual lesson, actually illustrate a lot about everyday life as well. And of course, we'll also consider the spiritual implications at those times because this is, after all, Bible class. So here is a map of the area we are looking at. We're looking at the area in blue, the Kingdom of Israel, as opposed to the southern Kingdom of Judah. And this is, yes, look, I won't go ranting on about it now, but for some strange reason, the ancient history syllabus in New South Wales chooses the Northern Kingdom as its focus rather than the Southern Kingdom, or indeed rather than both. So that's what I have looked at in particular. And you can see in the center there, the capital of the Kingdom of Israel is Samaria. And further to the north of that, not pictured on this map, are a couple of other significant cities, Jezreel and Megiddo. Megiddo is further out towards Mount Carmel, which is that little bump on the coast. And those are very important fortified cities, which actually my title slide was a picture of some gates at Megiddo that have been unearthed. Here's a bit of a timeline of the kings and prophets of Israel and Judah. So what we're going to be looking at in terms of our scope for tonight starts at Solomon. So we'll look at, I guess, the unified kingdom at times under Solomon, and then moving on from there, just that yellow strip along the top, all of the kings of Israel there. And you can see some of the prophets as well in between the yellow and green strips, and the prophets with yellow bands are specifically relating to Israel as well. So that's our timeline that we're looking at tonight. And the first thing to note about this is that the Northern Kingdom had nowhere near the level of continuity the Southern Kingdom had. The Southern Kingdom was the Davidic dynasty, and it had its ups and downs in terms of spirituality and focus and values, but it was just the one royal dynasty from start to finish, and it extends well beyond that timeline that's on the screen as well. I've just snapshotted the bit that contains Israel, which, as you can see, ends in Assyrian captivity during the reign of Hezekiah in the south. So Hoshea was the last king of Israel, and that is not just one dynasty you see there. It is, well, several, and some of them you wouldn't even call dynasties. They were just individual lone kings or father-son sort of situations. Only 2 dynasties were actually established in the Northern Kingdom, and I'll highlight those on the screen. There was the Omride dynasty in red there, which started with Omri and ended with Joram or Jehoram, and the Jehu dynasty, which starts with Jehu and ends with Jeroboam II. Those were the only 2 dynasties that actually managed to be established in the Northern Kingdom, and we'll talk a bit about that dynastic instability tonight. So we're going to go through a few categories now. Tonight we're going to really focus on the practical things, the nuts and bolts of society, things like the economy and how it worked, and also the different classes of society and how they interacted. And then next Wednesday, we're going to look at more of the religious and cultural aspects of the Northern Kingdom. And I will say as well, there should be plenty of time throughout tonight for people to butt in and ask questions and make comments. Be very happy to hear from anyone. This is a huge area of topic of study that I've just sort of scratched the surface of. So I'm sure some of you have your own insights that you can add, and I'm very happy to field questions as well. There'll be lots of bits and pieces to explore tonight. So the first topic I want to explore is the importance of agriculture. Now this is it's an interesting facet of both Israel and Judah, which perhaps sometimes we don't focus on enough, is how agricultural these nations were. Israel and Judah really relied on agriculture, like that was their thing. Farming and growing of crops was really the main source of stability and income in Israel and Judah. And this explains why things like the famine during the time of Elijah, sorry, the drought rather, was such a huge deal. Like it would have really crippled the economy entirely. It also makes sense when you think about the fact that Israel is situated on that fertile Rift Valley running up the eastern coast of the Mediterranean there. It's good fertile land. It's a good place to do agriculture. And when they needed other things like metals and ores, stone, timber, all of those other commodities of the ancient world, they had to trade for them. Israel didn't really produce these things on their own. Agriculture was really their thing. So let's look at some sources for this. Here's an example of looking at a prophecy, which would normally primarily have a spiritual application, and looking at it in a practical way. So Amos talks about this sort of social inequality that was going on in Israel. He's condemning people here. He says, they eat lambs from the flock and calves from the middle of the pen. They drink wine from sacrificial bowls, and they pour the very best oils on themselves. Now, the primary application of this verse is to look at those people and say, well, what a selfish, greedy, unfeeling, uncaring group of people. Look at them, lavishing attention and the best of the goods on themselves and ignoring all of the poor and needy. And absolutely, that is the case, and that's a good interpretation of the verses there. It's always interesting, though, to look at this in a historical light as well, because sort of removing the morality from the scene, what this simply tells us is that during the reign of Jeroboam II, it was a time of agricultural abundance. The rich and wealthy were able to enjoy all of these things, lambs and calves and wine and oil. It was a time of abundance. It's actually interesting that, as you would have seen on that timeline, the longest reign in the Northern Kingdom was Jeroboam II, the time of great stability and prosperity. And interestingly, it is a time that the Bible spends absolutely no time exploring in detail outside of these hints and allusions we get in the prophets condemning society at the time. God spends no time celebrating the reign of Jeroboam II, even though it was a time of prosperity. And that, of course, teaches us pretty important lessons about the fact that being successful in worldly terms does not mean being successful in spiritual terms. But that is a sign of the agricultural prosperity that happened during the reign of Jeroboam II. Proverbs has an interesting note about the link between, spirituality and having an abundant harvest. So Proverbs 3 verses 9 to 10 says, "Honor Yahweh with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will be bursting with wine." So here we can see that what people were looking forward to in terms of a reward, if they were to be rewarded with anything for their spirituality, well, it would be agricultural abundance. Barns filled with plenty, vats bursting with wine. That's what a good life looked like in Israel. It doesn't, mention, coffers overflowing with gold or beautiful cedar paneled houses. It's talking there about agricultural goods. In terms of some physical remains, what I've got a picture of here, this is an aerial view, a top-down view of a Jezreel winery. And this is no little, mom and pop operation thing that, set up and closed down overnight. This is a well-established permanent facility carved into the bedrock. This thing isn't going anywhere. And it supports the biblical record's claim that there were valuable vineyards in the Northern Kingdom. So, for instance, in 1 Kings, we've got King Ahab's unlawful seizure of Naboth's Jezreel vineyard. That's where Naboth's vineyard was. It was outside of the city of Jezreel, with the help of Jezebel's slanderous accusations. So it's interesting that we have some archaeological evidence for that kind of thing. This would have been a really valuable operation this vineyard and this winery. Little wonder that greedy King Ahab wanted to get his fingers on it. Moving on to a related topic, we'll talk about occupations, crafts, and industry. Here is a funny little archaeological discovery. These are what have been called hippo jars. They're called hippo jars because they look like hippos. They're big and round. And they are a distinctive Northern Kingdom form of pottery. This is something that has been distinctly associated with the Northern Kingdom of Israel. Interestingly, pottery production was done by men, and it actually used the male hand breadth to form the diameter of the opening at the top. They have scientifically and systematically measured these openings, and yeah, the man would put his hand into the opening there and sort of scoop it around, and that would form the diameter of that opening. It was a sort of a form of standardization. And yes, they've got a note here that over 350 years of production, it seemed to stay pretty much the same. Indeed, it was actually the same measurement of unit that in Hebrew is called a tefah, and I believe that is the same unit that appears a few times in the Law of Moses, the hand breadth. Modern Orthodox Jews also use it. I don't know if this is in the Law of Moses, but for constructing the booths for the Feast of Tabernacles. That's one of the key units of measurement for the Feast of Tabernacles. So that's an interesting little tidbit of information. Second Chronicles talks about a different type of occupation altogether. It talks about the royal traders. So Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kew. The royal merchants purchased them from Kew at the current price. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and the Arameans. So particularly during this time period in the ancient Near East, horses were a massive status symbol. To own a horse was a big deal. Only the rich and powerful could own horses. They were only ever at the service of the elite and the military. They were very impressive, and they would get them from the far south, from Egypt, or from Kew, which is up in southeast Turkey. There wasn't much horse breeding done actually in the Levant, in the regions of sort of Israel and Judah. So they were a serious business, and Solomon accumulated horses, which is something that the Israelites were warned about. They were said that kings will try to do this, and it will lead them astray. And you can see how this would happen, right? It would forge very strong trade links with foreign nations that had different values, and we know how much that started to undermine Solomon's spirituality. First Kings has another note about Solomon. It talks about the quarrying of stone. At King Solomon's command, they removed from the quarry large blocks of high-grade stone to provide a foundation of dressed stone for the temple. The craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and workers from Byblos cut and prepared the timber and stone for the building of the temple. So we've also got hints there in that verse of the way that Israel would recruit foreign support when they were working outside of their area of expertise. Quarrying and dressing stone was not one of Israel's areas of expertise, so they got some outside help from the Phoenicians. Byblos was one of the key cities of Phoenicia. I think it's actually where the Phoenician alphabet, which became the foundation of Hebrew and Greek and basically everything, that was invented in Byblos, or at least that's where we have the earliest evidence for it. And yes, I guess this would probably include the kind of limestone that you see in Jerusalem today as well. There's actually a law in Jerusalem that new structures in certain areas have to be capped with Jerusalem limestone. It's this very beautiful stone that gives it this golden color. And I imagine this would probably be similar to the sort of stuff they were working with back then. One more little hint at occupations, crafts, and industry, and this is, again, taking a prophecy and using it in a historical way. It's from Hosea 13. It talks about the Israelites making for themselves metal images, idols skillfully made of their silver, all of them the work of craftsmen. Now, in a spiritual sense, this is terrible. The people should not be making idols, especially not investing all this time and wealth in doing so. But in a historical way, this is yet another indication of prosperity during the reign of Jeroboam II. They had access to silver and skilled craftsmen with which to do this sort of thing. So it shows again that the Northern Kingdom was a pretty prosperous place at times. And once again, it's interesting to note that this very prosperous reign of King Jeroboam II, which gets no airtime in books of Kings and Chronicles, was a very successful time in a worldly measurement. Oops. Have a look now at technology. What kind of technologies or evidence of technology do we have in ancient Israel? Well, once again, looking at a prophecy from a historical perspective, here is a passage from Isaiah 28. It says, "Does he who plows for sowing plow continually? Does he continually open and harrow his ground? Dill is not threshed with a threshing sledge, nor is a cartwheel rolled over cumin, but dill is beaten out with a stick, and cumin with a rod. Does one crush grain for bread?" So this primarily has a spiritual application. I can't actually remember the rhetorical point this is trying to make. Something about not behaving appropriately in the situation. That might be one to look up at the end of the class. But we can see in this verse, some indications of the kind of technologies that Israel was applying to their agriculture. They had threshing sledges and cartwheels and plows. In fact, here's a slide just illustrating a bit of how that worked. So on the left there, you've got a reconstruction of a threshing sledge. This was a bunch of planks of wood put together into a sledge, and into the base of it, they would embed these really jagged, hard rocks and stones. And then they would run that over the top of the harvested wheat. And you can see a picture of that down in the bottom right there. They would hitch it up to a pair of oxen, and they would go round and round in circles over the wheat, and that would pummel it and grind it, and would separate out the wheat from the chaff. And then they would take that over to the process of winnowing. In that picture on the left there, you've got a reconstruction of a winnowing fork, and they would scoop it up and fling it into the air in a nice windy area, a threshing floor, somewhere where there was sort of a natural wind tunnel effect kind of thing. And the wind would carry away the chaff and leave behind that good grain. So that's a threshing sledge. That's the kind of technology that Isaiah is talking about there that has been used in the ancient Near East for millennia. Pretty cool stuff. Another piece of technology they've found is this iron saw. This was found in northern Israel. There's been a lot of different iron tools found in Israel. I just thought this one was particularly interesting because you don't really imagine, saws as we have them today in the ancient world, but they did have them. You can see little serrated teeth on it there. This is a cool piece of technology. Now, the manufacture of iron tools and weapons was not something Israel specialized in. Once again, usually this sort of thing was outsourced. And we know that the Philistines initially had a monopoly on its trade during the time period of the judges and into the reign of David as well. The Philistines had a grip of iron on all the iron. And this is, it's interesting to find this tool in northern Israel as well, which is where a lot of the timber production would have gone on, heading up towards Lebanon, where they grew the cedars, and they would have used tools like this for their timber production. It's actually kind of hard to as well, and this was a struggle I faced in preparing content for the history course. It's very hard to find, to pinpoint artifacts from the specific time period of the Northern Kingdom of Israel. Basically, it's just because there are just so many layers of culture and settlement and destruction in Israel. This is a land that, in the words of Scripture, was really trodden underfoot. You had, of course, prior to the Israelites, you had the Canaanites. You had all of the wars that went on during the time of Israel. You had the successive occupations of the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. Then further on into the Byzantines and the Turks. This was a land that really got layers upon layers. So it can be quite a task when you're doing a bit of research to try and find artifacts that actually date specifically to this time period. Another really interesting piece of technology, something that before I researched the course I'd never even heard of, is this water tunnel at Megiddo. So this was probably constructed during the reign of Omri or Ahab, and this is a pretty significant piece of hydraulic engineering. It's not on quite the same scale as what am I trying to say? That's Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem, but it's still pretty impressive. So a shaft was sunk through rock to a depth of 37 meters, and then it met a 65-meter tunnel going across, and you can actually walk through it today. It allowed inhabitants to access water from a spring outside the city walls in the event of a siege, and as I've noted there, it was a significant feat of hydraulic engineering, and this is a sign of the kind of technology they had at their disposal in the Northern Kingdom. And of course, you know, if you're up against foes like the Assyrians, as indeed Ahab was a couple of points in his reign, you needed to have this kind of reservoir at your disposal. Very, very important for keeping a city safe and secure in the event of siege. Talk a bit more about economic exchange, the kind of trading that went on in Israel. How did they trade and interact with the nations around them? Second Chronicles has an interesting note about the reign of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat is, normally considered one of the good kings, right? He was very passionate about the law and about worship of Yahweh and about ensuring that these things were done consistently and that the people were taught in these ways. He initiated these big education programs, which is awesome stuff. But interestingly, Second Chronicles mentions a little slip up of Jehoshaphat. It talks about him joining with Ahaziah, king of Israel, who acted wickedly, and he joined him in building ships to go to Tarshish, and they built the ships in Ezion-Geber. So this is an example of maritime trade during the Northern Kingdom of Israel. And Ahaziah, the northern king, is participating in this. There's some trade going on between Israel and Judah, and they're even sending ships off as far as Tarshish. There's much debate about exactly where that is, but far away is the simple answer. This, in the words of Scripture, did not end up well. The next couple of verses have this to say: Eliezer, the son of Dodavahu of Marashah, prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, "Because you have joined with Ahaziah, the Lord will destroy what you have made." And the ships were wrecked and were not able to go to Tarshish. So whatever efforts at economic exchange were going on here, they didn't end up very well. Miller and Hayes are a couple of modern historians who've written about ancient Israel. They had some really interesting comments to make about the relationship between Israel and Assyria. We tend to think of Assyria as the enemy, and indeed they were. Like Ahab, as we will see tonight, actually mounted a campaign against Assyria alongside several other kings. The Assyrians are the ones who ultimately destroyed Israel and Samaria. But what Miller and Hayes basically discuss is the fact that Assyria, in many situations, was actually good for Israel. Because what Assyria did is they kept some level of control over the region. The Assyrians were so aggressive and so involved in the whole Fertile Crescent that it basically kept the Aramaeans, Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites busy fighting them and preparing to fight them, so that less local conflict went on. During the Jehu dynasty, interestingly, Assyria started to decline. And so these other nations started to get a bit big and strong again, and a bit too big for their britches. And Israel and Judah, according to Miller and Hayes, were surrounded by opposition states, and they were shut off from the larger world of trade and commerce for the first time in several decades. They no longer had this option of trading with, with Assyria, which is described in Hosea. Hosea condemns Israel. He's talking about, uses that sort of metaphorical kind of name, symbolic name of Israel, which is Ephraim. He says, Ephraim feeds on the wind and pursues the east wind all day long. They multiply falsehood and violence. They make a covenant with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt. So this verse clearly states that Israel had trade alliances with Assyria and Egypt. I guess similar to the kinds of things that were going on in times of Solomon with the horse trade, but this time it's oil. And note again, it's an agricultural product that they're trading. It's not wood, it's not metal, it's not slaves, it's oil that Israel is trading. And that would be olive oil, by the way. This is an interesting Assyrian artifact which records things about the Northern Kingdom. So this is a stele, a sort of a thing that you set up to commemorate a victory of Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyrian king. It's a royal Assyrian inscription, and it records that Menahem, king of Israel, paid tribute to Assyria. This is what Second Kings backs this up. It describes the exact same event. Pul, which was kind of the nickname of Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver that he might help him to confirm his hold on the royal power. So we can see here Israel trading silver for trying to consolidate their grip on power. Sadly for Menahem, all this really did is gave Assyria more of a foot in the door to eventually come in and take over the entire nation. Interesting as well, we've got trade of silver there rather than oil or other agricultural products. I suppose this would have to do with the fact that Assyria liked to carry off impressive goods, impressive booty in their inscriptions and things. So probably silver sounded a bit more impressive than anything else they had to provide. Second Chronicles, and to sort of go back to more positive, happy times, back in the time of Solomon, we have a description of economic exchange between Hiram and Solomon. So in a letter from the Phoenician king Hiram, Second Chronicles records, "Now let my lord Solomon send to his servants the wheat, barley, olive oil, and wine he has promised." Those are the things that Israel had to barter with. "We will get all the timber you need from Lebanon and bring it in raft-like bundles by sea to Joppa. You can then haul it on up to Jerusalem." Which is a pretty cool way of transporting timber, to like just make it into big rafts and then send it down the coast. And it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And of course, Joppa, very important port of Israel, still is to this day. Jaffa, I think it's called now. All right. We'll talk now about a bit of social hierarchy, about how society was structured. We'll start in human terms at the top, the role of the king. So coming back to Miller and Hayes. Now Miller and Hayes, along with many other modern historians, use a piece of terminology that at times can be quite uncomfortable, but from a historical perspective makes a lot of sense. And that is the term Yahwism or Yahwists. So Yahwism is the term that modern historians use to describe the worship of Yahweh, that specific religion. And this is, this kind of rubs us the wrong way, doesn't it, sometimes, because it seems like using God's name in a very technical, sort of secular way. But from a historical perspective, sadly, it makes a lot of sense. We can't just talk about God in a historical sense, because sadly, Israel had many gods. Yahweh was just one of them. That's how they treated him for much of their history. But Miller and Hayes had this to say about Yahwism. They said Yahwists strongly believed in royal Zion theology. This is what Orthodox Yahwists, the good ones, I guess, according to our understanding, believed in, which claimed that Yahweh had granted the exclusive right to rule his people to a Judean dynasty founded by David and centered in Jerusalem. It's interesting to see, modern historians outlining essentially what we would call the promises to David. This is something that is understood in the historical community, that this was a phenomenon that was a strong underpinning in Judah. Part of the reason for the dynastic instability in the Northern Kingdom was the lack of any such sustaining royal narrative. They had lost their connection to David, they had lost their connection to Jerusalem and the temple, and so they had very little to go on. This is why Jeroboam had to initiate things like the worship of the calves in Dan and Bethel. to try and create some sense of connection with their history of Egypt, coming out of Egypt, the Exodus, Moses, all of that. Sort of a desperate attempt to cling on to some kind of legitimacy. The Northern Kingdom, as I said as well before, was pretty bloodthirsty. We get kings bumping each other off left, right, and center. So, for instance, here's a textbook example. So Baasha killed Nadab and reigned in his place. And as soon as he was king, he killed all the house of Jeroboam. He left to the house of Jeroboam not one that breathed until he had destroyed it. So a really, really brutal description of a royal purge going on here. You can sort of contrast this with, for instance, the actions of King David when he searches out Mephibosheth so that he can show kindness to him and care for him. This is not how kings consolidated power in the ancient world. If David was being a true king of the time, he would have made sure Mephibosheth was executed, so that there wasn't a single person left in the house of Saul, just as Baasha did to the house of Jeroboam. So there's, I guess, a nice contrast with what a true godly king would do. Got an interesting, another Assyrian artifact that reveals things about the role of the king in Israel. This is the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, and it records the tribute of Jehu of the house of Omri. It specifically says that in cuneiform. And this notably is the only contemporary visual depiction we have of a king of Israel, whether north or south, in all of ancient history. I think on the next slide I've got a bigger picture of this, but you can see Jehu bowing down there on the middle row. That is the only visual depiction of a king of Israel that we actually have, which is a pretty precious thing. Over 100 years later, interestingly, Tiglath-Pileser still referred to the kingdom of Israel in this way. He called it the land of Bit-Humri, which means the house of Omri. All of its people and its possessions I took away to Assyria. That's recorded in 2 Kings. I won't go into the verse right now, but that same historical event is recorded. So yeah, it really shows the significance of the Omride dynasty in the north. Jehu wasn't even part of the Omride dynasty. He was literally the guy who killed them, who ended it. But that is how famous the Omride dynasty became, Omri, Ahab, and so on, that Jehu, and even 100 years later, Israel was still being referred to as the land of Bit-Humri, the house of Omri. And that kind of demonstrates the power and prosperity of the Omride dynasty. They clearly made a big impact, if that's just how people referred to Israel. Speaking of Assyrian records, I've mentioned that a couple of times. The Assyrian records actually provide a really valuable source for the Northern Kingdom. They had pretty regular and pretty unfriendly contact with Israel throughout this time period. So as we had on the previous slide, there's the Black Obelisk. There's Jehu bowing down and offering tribute in 841 BCE. We have the Rima stele recording Jehoash paying tributes to Assyria about 40 years later. And we've got that earlier one I showed you, the stele of Tiglath-Pileser III, recording that Menahem paid tribute to Assyria another sort of 60 years further on. So the Assyrians really helped to record and provide evidence for the actual historical reality of these kings. Those names, Jehu, Jehoash, and Menahem, are specifically mentioned on those artifacts, which is pretty cool. We'll talk also about the role of women in Israel. Now, this is a particular focus of the history syllabus in New South Wales, and it's kind of, I guess, in recognition of the fact that in history, you have to be very deliberate if you want to discover what the role of women was in an ancient society. They tended to have a much less significant role in society in terms of they had less agency, they had less decisions they could make, and they weren't recorded as often. In historical texts, women do not appear as often. Interesting to look at the role of Bathsheba in David's later life in terms of how royal women could influence things. So in 1 Kings 1, Bathsheba said to King David, "My lord, you swore to your servant by Yahweh your God, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne. And now behold, Adonijah is king, although you, my lord the king, do not know it." So Bathsheba here plays a very powerful role in the politics of Israel, and ensuring that Solomon would be the next king. David's oath to Bathsheba suggests that she was taken quite seriously in terms of this issue of legitimacy. Also got sort of I guess a negative example to compare that is the role of Jezebel during the time of King Ahab. Jezebel wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with his seal, and sent the letters to the elders and to the nobles that were in Jezreel dwelling with Naboth. Now, this would tend to indicate, and I think this is more than just Jezebel having a strong personality. This tends to suggest that a queen of Israel could actually exercise quite a bit of agency. She could seal letters with the king's seal, and, well, I mean, just the mere fact that she was able to do this implies literacy, right? She could read and write, which already is a scarcity in the ancient world, particularly for women. They simply weren't taught. So this is interesting that these royal women had the ability to do this sort of thing. Not just using potentially Ahab's seal, we've got a very intriguing artifact here, which some have claimed is the seal of Jezebel. This is an ancient seal. Now, it turns, the interpretation of this artifact turns very much on that little bit that's missing just at the top there. There's it is required that there is a missing character there, which would confirm that this is Jezebel. But some people believe this is quite likely. It's a very large seal, so it would definitely have belonged to someone very high up and powerful. If not the royal family, then it's definitely sort of second in command territory. And if authentic, this would be strong evidence for the authority of royal women. They would be able to seal royal documents, including legal and business documents. So a very interesting artifact there, which may be historical evidence for the existence of Jezebel. Interesting to think about Proverbs 31 in the context of all of this. It talks about a woman there, an idealized woman, who rises while it is night and provides food for the household. She considers a field and buys it. She opens her mouth with wisdom. And now it is highly unlikely that the average woman in the time of the Kingdom of Israel would have had the ability to do these sorts of things. But perhaps some elite women have this kind of agency. It certainly shows some degree of respect towards women in society that this was recorded. It is possible, of course, that this is just an extension of the wisdom metaphor that goes through Proverbs about the lady wisdom that sort of introduces the book. I'll sort of talk about these next time, but I'll kind of lump them in here as well because they are somewhat relevant. It's also interesting to think about the women that Elijah interacted with during his ministry. Women like the woman of the Shunammite woman, someone who was quite wealthy and influential, who was able to make decisions. We will look at her more next time. And also Elijah's interactions with, well, I guess not Elijah's interactions with, but Naaman's interactions with the Israelite servant girl that was taken away to his household. This is interesting because when we get to the stories of Elijah, the scale of the books of Kings and Chronicles kind of zooms in for a moment. It gets much more personal. It talks about the personal lives of people instead of sort of the big actions of empires and kings and whole nations. So that's interesting that we sort of get a bit more of an insight into the role of women in those chapters. That's where they come more to the fore. And again, it shows that the Bible is interested in real people. God is interested in real people. He would record these kind of people. He would record, a successful, powerful, influential general like Naaman being influenced by a little servant girl. It's quite an interesting thing to think about from a historical perspective. We'll finish up tonight by talking about the role of the army. Now, along with, I guess, well, I've sort of already talked about the bloodthirstiness of the kings of Israel, and their bloodthirstiness had its outlet in the form of the army. So, for instance, in 1 Kings 16, when the Israelites in the camp heard that Zimri had plotted against the king and murdered him, they proclaimed Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that very day there in the camp. So Omri there started off as a military commander, and he quickly rose up to become king of Israel and establish a powerful dynasty. So the army were kingmakers in that way. They had the ability to influence politics and put people forward in that way. The kings had an important connection to the army, and they were expected to exercise military control. So once again, Jeroboam II restored the border of Israel from Lebo Hamath in the north to the Sea of the Rift Valley in the south, just as the message from Yahweh, God of Israel, just as in the message from Yahweh, the God of Israel, that he had announced through his servant Jonah. His military success in restoring Israelite control over Damascus and Hamath is recorded in the scroll called the Annals of the Kings of Israel. So there's, yes, a fascinating passage for a couple of reasons. So once again, Jeroboam II, very successful king, even though he was ungodly. And also, we have the only other reference to Jonah in the Old Testament apart from the book of Jonah. This was his, we believe, his past experience before the whole being swallowed by a fish thing. Was his prophecy that Jeroboam would restore the borders of Israel. This kind of gives a bit of, I guess, context as to Jonah's pride in his role. He had prophesied the expansion of Israel, and then he was told to go and preach repentance to the Assyrians, which would not have sat well with him, right? The Assyrians were the enemy of Israel. Why would you go and preach to your enemies? This may have, put a bit of a chip on Jonah's shoulder, as it were. One more artifact I'd like to point out is another Assyrian inscription. This is called the Kirk monolith. And this is an inscription of Shalmaneser III, which includes a description of the Battle of Karkar. Now, this was one of the biggest battles of the ancient Middle East. It's colossal. This was the Assyrians versus a confederacy of 12 kings from the region of Israel. Interestingly, this is not recorded in the Bible. According to the inscription, Ahab, King Ahab, the one from the Bible, committed a force of 2,000 chariots and 10,000 foot soldiers to a coalition opposing Assyria, which is a pretty substantial fighting force, particularly those chariots. There's possibly some exaggeration in the numbers there, but yeah, that's a big chunk of chariots. It really affirms the central role of chariots in the Israelite army, regardless of how that number is taken. Interestingly, Solomon kind of started off the whole chariot thing with his acquisition of horses and his establishment of fortified cities in the north, places like Megiddo and Jezreel. These cities were kind of set up in an interesting way. They were put on high vantage points, kind of like hills or plateaus, and they were set up, I guess that makes them, very easily defensible, but they were set up in areas where there were big surrounding plains. What this meant is that you could have this garrison of horses up on top of the hill, all your stables and your chariots and things, and then in the event of an attack, you could launch them down the hill into the enemy, and they could zoom around the plains, wiping them all out, which is a pretty dramatic way to win a battle. So that was kind of part of Israel's defensive and military strategy, was having chariot garrisons at the top of hills that could then zoom down and attack the enemy. Which is an interesting way of doing things. So, to wrap up some key ideas from tonight, Israel was an agricultural nation. They relied on trading agricultural goods for other materials and services. And we see this coming out, dropped my notes, in lots of cultural references in prophecies, in parables, in scripture. Culturally speaking, Israel was kind of doomed from the start. Without the connection to Jerusalem and the temple and the Davidic dynasty, their own culture just kind of gradually eroded. And we'll talk more about that next time in terms of the impact on religion and culture from the surrounding nations. And once again, it's kind of an indication of where Solomon's kingdom was going. Without God, Solomon was nothing. And that's really what ended up happening to Israel. They were wiped out a couple of centuries earlier than Judah. Prophecies, interestingly, are also full of historical details that speak to the reality of Israel's historical culture. Details like that one from Isaiah, listing all of the agricultural equipment and implements. Those prophecies, while they teach us important spiritual lessons, can also sort of glean historical information from them. The grandest secular achievements of Israel get barely a passing mention in the Bible. Things like Jeroboam II's prosperity and successes. The only reason they ever come up in the Bible is in the sort of veiled references we get in the prophecies of people like Amos, who are condemning the elite for their lack of care, for how much of a sad parody of God's people they have become in their oppressive practices. And finally, there are many historical artifacts that demonstrate the historical reliability of the biblical record of ancient Israel. And these sorts of things are being discovered more and more all the time, which is pretty exciting. Gone are the days of the sort of 19th century historical criticism, where they could claim, well, there just isn't any evidence for the kings of Israel. There's plenty of evidence, which is an exciting thing. And just one of the ways that we can affirm faith in the scriptures.